Welcome to Week 4 of Systematic Theology. This week we're going to be talking about evangelical theology. Now you're all studying at Tyndale, and Tyndale is an evangelical school. But what does that even mean? What does it mean to be an evangelical, and what does it mean to do theology from an evangelical perspective? This is a big question today because the whole meaning of the term evangelical is contested. It's controversial. Many these days are seeking to distance themselves from the word evangelical, often fearing that it's becoming more and more fundamentalist in orientation, or it's become too aligned with right-wing politics and so forth. So we're going to be asking, well, what does it mean to be an evangelical anyways, and what characterizes evangelical theology? The first thing to note is that evangelicalism is a broad movement, both globally and historically. And we could point out a number of figures that could represent the evangelical movement, so it's difficult to pin down precisely. Let's start with Martin Luther. Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation, and in his day, the word evangelical was simply synonymous with the word Protestant. It was a faith that was rooted to Scripture, and particularly the gospel and the theology of justification by faith. And so as a theology oriented to the gospel, or the evangel, or evangelion, this represented an evangelical movement within the church. Here's a very different figure, John Stott, an important representative of evangelicalism in the UK, during the 20th century, British, but had a wide influence throughout the world and in North America as well. John Stott was a New Testament scholar and a popular preacher and writer of commentaries and other books. Many pastors appreciated his commentaries because they were both scholarly and thoughtful, and yet also deeply practical and oriented to the church at the same time. Stott had a passion for the gospel, and he emphasized a holistic gospel that brought good news in both word and deed to the world and to those in need. Stott represented a broad evangelicalism, a generous evangelicalism, one that was conservative in its orientation and yet not afraid to ask big questions. For example, during his own lifetime, Stott questioned the doctrine of hell as a place of eternal conscious torment. Now, he believed that hell existed and that judgment was a reality, but he raised questions on the basis of his reading of Scripture of the idea that people are sent to this place where they're tortured forever and ever consciously. He was not sure that that panned out with Scripture and with the heart of Christ. The point I'm making, though, is that he wasn't afraid to raise questions, even though he stood within this predominantly mainstream and conservative tradition. Another representative of evangelicalism in our day, again from the United Kingdom, is N.T. Wright, the famous New Testament scholar, historian, former bishop of the Church of England, and professor of New Testament at St. Andrews. N.T. Wright is widely known both for his scholarship but also for his accessible writing. Like Stott, he publishes a number of commentaries and other writings for at the popular level for lay people, in addition to being a great scholar and someone who has made tremendous contributions to his own field. Wright also is known as someone who's a broad kind of evangelical, so would resist narrow conceptions of the faith, and more fundamentalist orientations within evangelicalism. Wright represents a broader perspective than some of those other ones. If you were to ask somebody in 20th century America, what's an evangelical, they might well respond, somebody who likes Billy Graham. Billy Graham became the public face of evangelicalism in America and in many parts of the world during the 20th century through his evangelism crusades. And Graham, again, was a generous and broad kind of evangelical, generally conservative in his orientation, but willing to dialogue with others, including Catholics and including other Protestant traditions that weren't his own. Sometimes, in fact, more conservative-leaning evangelicals or fundamentalists were critical of Graham for making those kinds of concessions, you might say, or forming those kinds of bridges. But I think it points to his integrity and his heart for God and for people. This is a picture from Hillsong Church, another contemporary expression of evangelicalism today. Maybe a little bit more on the charismatic end of things, definitely in terms of the contemporary worship scene, widely influential. But again, a slightly different flavor of evangelicalism. And of course, Hillsong is in Australia. In addition to its diversity, we have to face the fact that evangelicalism today is somewhat fragmented. So it's diverse not just in terms of being globally diverse and culturally diverse and historically diverse. It's also diverse because it is divided in some ways. One of the reasons for this division has to do with controversy. Some years ago, Rob Bell came out with his book, Love Wins. And you all watched the video of that just before class. I'm really curious as to how you responded to that video. I imagine some of you were excited and cheering him on, and others were nervous, disagreeing, maybe strongly disagreeing with what he was saying. I just cite him to illustrate a controversy that has characterized evangelicalism. And when this book came out, it was being denounced by various readers just on the basis of the blurbs and the summaries. Some of the critics hadn't even read the book yet. John Piper, for one, famously tweeted or wrote or something, "Goodbye, Rob," after this book had been promoted. So an example of controversy within the movement, disagreement leading to division. We've also faced a fair bit of controversy because of moral failure in the evangelical movement. Whether this has to do with church leaders and pastors that had moral failures in terms of their use of power, in terms of inappropriate relationships, some of them sexual predators and so forth. This has created a fair bit of controversy and has hurt the image of the evangelical movement. Now, often these are big churches that are in the limelight. It doesn't represent the movement as a whole, but even so, these stories get out into the media and cause concern amongst people, and rightly so. More recently, there's been concern about the alignment of the evangelical movement with right-wing politics, and particularly politics on the right-wing conservative side, the religious right, and so forth. For example, I know a lot of people who don't want to call themselves evangelicals anymore simply because they've heard that 81% of evangelicals in the U.S. voted for Trump. White evangelicals, that is. Now, whether or not you agree with that or like Trump or not, the fact remains that evangelicalism has a tarnished reputation because of controversy, because of moral failure, and because it has appeared to cozy up to certain forms of politics. And that's particularly disturbed people when that politics hasn't shown the love of Christ, where it's been maybe rude or involving moral failure or not open to refugees and immigrants and so forth, racist elements, that kind of thing. So there's a fair bit of controversy surrounding evangelicalism right now that increases that sense of division. Many have wondered whether or not we should move beyond evangelicalism. Increasingly, people are hesitant to align themselves with the evangelical movement. And I think in many ways, this is a reaction to fundamentalist tendencies within the movement. John Stott was once asked in an interview in Christianity Today whether he had heard the term post-evangelical and the movement toward people leaving evangelicalism behind and becoming post-evangelicals. And the interviewer asked John Stott, "Does it alarm you to hear people calling themselves post-evangelical?" And Stott's answer was, "Yes, I don't know what they mean, but it does alarm me. If you are post anything, you are leaving something behind, and I want to know what it is. If it's our many faults and failures, fine, but that's not post-evangelicalism. It's post-twisted evangelicalism." And Stott raises a helpful point. If we're going to criticize something, we should look at the movement in its best light as well as in its worst light. And we should be fair and gracious to what it is we're criticizing. I often find that people's picture of evangelicalism is overdetermined by American media. And so when sometimes people reject evangelicalism, they don't realize that what they're doing is rejecting a global movement on the basis of a fairly limited expression of it, namely an American expression of it. Roger Olson, who is an evangelical theologian, wrote a book called Reformed and Always Reforming: The Post-Conservative Approach to Evangelical Theology. And if you're wrestling over evangelical identity, whether to consider yourself one or not, it might be helpful for you to know about this book. Olson claims that the evangelical movement is a diverse movement, and that we should not talk about evangelical theology, but really we need to talk about evangelical theologies in the plural. In particular, he identifies two predominant movements: one, a more conservative form of evangelicalism and evangelical theology. He characterizes this particular kind of evangelicalism as being foundationalist in nature, in thinking of theology primarily in terms of propositionalist, being propositionalist, and of allowing a kind of unspoken and unwritten tradition to govern how it operates. It's a style of evangelical theology that's concerned with policing its boundaries and with insiders and outsiders. In contrast to that, he identifies a newer movement within evangelical theology, which he calls post-conservative evangelical theology, and he aligns himself with this movement, along with a number of other theologians, people like Stan Grenz and Clark Pinnock and Kevin Van Hooser and others. This is a post-foundationalist approach to theology, and it's not as concerned with policing boundaries and beliefs, even though it does hold to some pretty central boundaries and beliefs from a certain perspective. The claim of Olson in this book is that by being post-conservative, we can actually be more evangelical. So by being less conservative, we can be more evangelical. Now, he's not arguing that we should become liberals. That's a different tradition. But within this broadly conservative Protestant tradition, there is this sort of conservative, foundationalist-leaning approach and this post-conservative, more open kind of approach. And he endorses the latter. So if that tweaks your interest, I'd recommend this book to you. But I like his point, and I think it's accurate, that when we speak about evangelicalism, certainly globally, but even within North America, we need to talk about evangelical theologies, not simply evangelical theology. Well, I hope this has helped to illustrate the diversity of the movement to some extent, its cultural diversity, its historical diversity, and its diversity in light of recent controversies. In the next part of the lecture, we are going to give some more precise definitions to what evangelical even means, and what it means to do evangelical theology. Again, that's what we're studying at Tyndale. We're part of an evangelical tradition. And so we want to understand that so that we can do what the Reformer suggested. We want to always be reformed and continue to reform our thinking in light of the gospel.